The deeper you go into untouched forest, the quieter the world becomes. The wind softens, animal sounds fade, and the towering trees begin to feel less like nature and more like walls closing around you. Rangers who patrol these remote places are trained to expect the unexpected: lost hikers, injured wildlife, sometimes strange geological formations, but every once in a while, they find something that doesn't belong to nature at all. Tonight on Mr. Whisper's Official, we're exploring 3 terrifying encounters where deep forest rangers discovered hidden underground nursery rooms buried beneath centuries of soil and roots. These chambers weren't natural caves. They were carefully shaped spaces carved directly into the bedrock, containing primitive stone cradles and evidence of something that may still be growing beneath the forest floor. What kind of life could exist in airless rooms hidden far from human eyes? Who or what built them? Why were they placed directly beneath the deepest parts of the forest? If you enjoy true horror storytelling and strange mysteries that make you question the world around you, take a moment to subscribe to Mr. Whisper's Official, because tonight's stories will take us somewhere most people never want to go: deep underground, beneath the oldest forests on Earth. Madison had worked as a forest ranger for nearly 8 years in one of the most remote timberland regions in North America, a place where satellite signals faded, roads disappeared into dirt tracks. The trees were so dense that sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor. In early spring, after a series of unusual thermal readings appeared on newly released satellite scans, Madison and 2 other rangers were assigned to inspect a restricted section of forest that had been closed to the public for decades. The data suggested pockets of warmth beneath the ground, which initially sounded like nothing more than geothermal irregularities. But when Madison arrived at the coordinates, the area felt wrong almost immediately. The forest there was unnaturally quiet, and the moss covering the ground seemed thicker than anywhere else she had seen in the region. As she carefully stepped through the damp terrain, her boots struck something solid beneath the moss. Brushing away the surface layer revealed a perfectly circular outline carved into the soil, barely visible beneath years of natural growth. It looked like a hatch embedded directly into the earth, something far too symmetrical to be a natural formation. When Madison and the other rangers cleared the surrounding moss and dirt, the circular cover shifted slightly under pressure, releasing a faint gust of cold, stale air from below. None of them spoke for a moment. Every ranger knew the rule: never enter unknown underground spaces without a full team and proper ventilation equipment. But curiosity has a way of overpowering protocol, especially when you're standing in the middle of a forest that hasn't been touched by human hands for centuries. Madison slowly lifted the stone disc just enough to peer inside, and what she saw beneath the forest floor would stay with her long after that day. The shaft beneath the forest was deeper than Madison expected, dropping nearly 15 feet straight down, before opening into a narrow chamber carved directly into the bedrock. The air rising from the hole carried a damp, earthy smell mixed with something metallic that she couldn't immediately identify. After securing a rope line to a nearby tree, Madison descended first, her flashlight cutting through the darkness as her boots finally touched the cold stone floor below. The chamber was small but unmistakably artificial. The walls had been smoothed with careful precision, and along the edges of the room were shallow stone basins carved directly into the rock itself. At first, Madison assumed they were simple storage spaces, but as her flashlight moved across the chamber, the shape of the basins became disturbingly clear. Each one resembled a crude cradle curve depressions large enough to hold something roughly the size of a small child. There were 6 of them in total, evenly spaced around the chamber, and each contained dark stains that had soaked deep into the porous stone. The silence down there felt suffocating. There were no insects, no dripping water, not even the faint rustle of air moving through hidden cracks. The chamber had no visible ventilation at all, which meant whatever had used this place either didn't require much oxygen or had evolved to survive in conditions humans would find unbearable. When the other rangers joined Madison at the bottom of the shaft, they stood in stunned silence, slowly realizing they weren't looking at a forgotten bunker or a natural cave formation. They were standing inside something that had clearly been designed for a very specific purpose. Madison carefully examined the stone cradles, noticing that the surfaces inside them were smoother than the surrounding rock, as if something had been placed there repeatedly over a long period of time. Her flashlight revealed faint residue along the edges, dark streaks that glistened slightly in the beam of light. One of the other rangers collected a small sample using a sterile kit from their pack, sealing it inside a plastic container for later analysis. But even without lab results, the scene felt deeply unsettling. The chamber wasn't ancient in the way natural caves are ancient. The edges of the carved stone looked relatively fresh, and the floor showed shallow indentations scattered between the cradles. They weren't footprints exactly, or deeper, irregular depressions, almost as if something heavy had moved around the room using multiple points of contact instead of 2 feet. Madison crouched beside one of the marks, tracing the outline with her gloved hand. The indentation had 4 separate pressure points arranged in a rough arc, nothing like the tracks of any animal she had ever encountered in the forest. When she stood up again, she noticed something even more disturbing. Near the far wall of the chamber, a narrow tunnel continued deeper into the bedrock, sloping downward at an angle that swallowed the flashlight beam before it reached the end. The tunnel was too small for a human to comfortably crawl through, yet its walls were just as smooth and deliberate as the rest of the chamber. Whatever had created this underground nursery hadn't stopped at a single room. As Madison's team prepared to leave the chamber and report the discovery to their superiors, the silence underground suddenly shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint vibration traveling through the stone floor beneath their boots. Madison froze, holding her breath as the vibration returned a second time longer now, like something moving somewhere far below the chamber. The other rangers felt it too. None of them spoke, but the tension in the air was immediate and unmistakable. The tunnel leading deeper into the earth seemed darker now, as if the shadows inside it had thickened. Madison slowly turned off her flashlight for a moment, letting the darkness settle around them. In the complete silence that followed, she heard a faint scraping sound echoing from deep within the tunnel. It wasn't loud, but it was rhythmic, like claws dragging lightly against stone. The sound stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving the chamber silent again. Madison didn't hesitate after that. She ordered the team to climb back up the rope immediately. As she reached the surface and pulled herself onto the forest floor, the open shaft behind her felt like a wound in the earth, something that had been hidden for a reason. Before sealing the entrance again with the stone disc, Madison glanced down one last time. For just a fraction of a second, she thought she saw movement far below in the darkness, something shifting slowly within the tunnel that disappeared into the bedrock. And in that moment, one thought settled heavily in her mind. The nursery they had discovered might not have been abandoned at all. Maverick had spent more than a decade working as a forest ranger in one of the most isolated mountain forests in the region, a place where the trees were so tall and ancient that sunlight barely touched the damp ground below.
out there.
Rangers assigned to that sector often joked that the forest felt older than the maps used to patrol it. Not I-8 Autumn, Maverick and his partner were sent to investigate an unusual disturbance detected by aerial thermal imaging in an area of ground that remained strangely warm despite the cold temperatures surrounding it. At first, the anomaly was assumed to be a decaying tree root system or underground geothermal activity. But when Maverick arrived at the exact coordinates, the forest immediately felt wrong. The animals were gone. The usual sounds of birds and insects had disappeared, replaced by a deep silence that seemed to press against the ears. As Maverick carefully pushed aside layers of damp leaves and moss, he uncovered a perfectly round patch of stone embedded into the forest floor. It looked like a circular lid, camouflaged beneath decades of organic growth. The stone had grooves around its edge, suggesting it had been lifted before many times. When Maverick finally pried it open with the end of a metal bar, a gust of cold, stale air rose from the darkness below, carrying a smell that was earthy, damp, and faintly metallic. Beneath the opening was a narrow vertical shaft leading down into total darkness. Every instinct told Maverick that whatever lay below was not a natural formation, yet curiosity pushed him forward. After securing a rope to a nearby cedar tree, he switched on his flashlight and slowly began lowering himself into the unknown space hidden beneath the ancient forest. The shaft dropped nearly 20 feet before Maverick's boots touched solid ground. His flashlight beam revealed a chamber carved directly into the bedrock, its walls smooth and curved as if shaped with careful precision rather than natural erosion. The air inside the underground room felt heavy and humid, clinging to his skin in a way that made breathing feel slightly difficult. As Maverick moved deeper into the chamber, his light fell upon something that made him stop instantly. Along the curved wall of the room were several shallow depressions carved into the stone floor, arranged in a circular pattern. At first glance, they resembled primitive beds or basins, but their shape told a different story. Each one was curved like a cradle, perfectly contoured to hold something small and fragile. There were 8 of them in total, each carved with the same unsettling precision. Inside several of the cradles were faint dark stains that had soaked deep into the porous rock, forming irregular patterns that looked disturbingly organic. Maverick crouched beside one of them and ran his gloved fingers across the surface. The stone was smooth from repeated contact, far smoother than the surrounding floor. Something had rested in those cradles many times before. Something living. When his flashlight swept across the center of the chamber, Maverick noticed something else. Thin scratch marks running along the floor between the cradles and the far wall. The marks were shallow but numerous, overlapping in tangled patterns that suggested movement. They weren't shaped like boot prints or animal tracks. Instead, they looked like the dragging paths of multiple limbs moving across the stone in slow, deliberate motions. Maverick's attention eventually shifted toward the far side of the chamber where a narrow passage sloped downward into the bedrock. The tunnel entrance was small, too small for an adult human to enter comfortably, but its walls were clearly carved with the same deliberate craftsmanship as the main room. The deeper Maverick shined his flashlight into the passage, the more the beam seemed to vanish into darkness, swallowed by the tight curves of the descending tunnel. The air drifting out of that passage felt warmer than the rest of the chamber, carrying a faint scent that reminded Maverick of wet soil mixed with something unfamiliar and biological. As he stood there studying the entrance, a quiet realization settled over him. This underground chamber wasn't a shelter or storage space. It looked more like a nursery environment designed for early development, rather than long-term habitation. The cradles carved into the stone weren't beds, they're holding spaces. places where something small could remain protected until it was ready to move deeper underground. The scratch marks along the floor suddenly made more sense as well. They suggested movement from the cradles toward the tunnel, as if whatever had grown there eventually crawled or climbed into the deeper passage once it reached a certain stage of life. Maverick felt a chill run through him despite the humid air. If this chamber truly was a nursery, then the most disturbing question was not what had once used it, but whether it was still being used now. While documenting the chamber with his camera, Maverick noticed something else that immediately unsettled him. The stone cradles were not empty. Inside several of them were thin layers of damp organic residue, almost like dried mucus or biological film clinging to the curved surfaces. Under the beam of his flashlight, the residue reflected a dull sheen, suggesting it hadn't completely dried out. That meant it was relatively recent. Maverick collected a small sample using a sterile tool from his field kit and sealed it inside a specimen container. Even through the gloves, the texture of the material felt strange, thicker than water, but lighter than sap, with a faint metallic smell similar to iron. As he sealed the container, a faint sound echoed from somewhere beyond the narrow tunnel. Maverick froze instantly, listening. At first, it sounded like shifting stones or soil settling underground. But then the sound came again, slightly clearer this time. A slow scraping noise moving deeper within the passage. It wasn't loud, but the rhythm was unmistakable.
Bounce.
Something was moving down there. The scraping continued for several seconds before fading into silence once more. Maverick slowly turned off his flashlight and stood still in the darkness, listening carefully. The silence returned almost immediately, thick and absolute. But the brief sound had already confirmed something he didn't want to believe. The tunnels beneath that chamber were not empty. Maverick wasted no time climbing back toward the surface after that. As he ascended the rope, the darkness below seemed heavier than before, as though the underground space itself was aware of his presence. When he finally pulled himself onto the forest floor, the fresh air felt almost shocking after the humid stillness of the chamber. His partner helped seal the circular stone lid back into place, covering it with the same moss and soil that had hidden it for decades. But even after the entrance was concealed again, Maverick couldn't shake the feeling that the forest around them had changed. The silence between the trees felt deeper, more watchful. As they packed their equipment and prepared to leave the area, Maverick looked back once more at the patch of ground beneath which the hidden nursery lay buried. Somewhere beneath those roots and stones, the narrow tunnel continued descending into darkness. It damned, if the chamber they discovered was truly a nursery, then it meant something had once been raised there and possibly still was. And whatever lived deeper in those underground passages had remained hidden long enough to grow without the world above ever noticing. Nevaeh had only been a forest ranger for 3 years, but she had already learned that the deepest sections of protected wilderness held a strange kind of silence. It wasn't simply the absence of sound, it was the feeling that the forest itself was holding its breath. In the early summer of 2026, Nevaeh was assigned to patrol a remote stretch of old-growth forest that had recently been closed to hikers after several unexplained equipment malfunctions were reported by a survey team. GPS devices were losing signal, ground sensors were showing unusual underground heat patterns, and several camera traps had stopped transmitting data entirely. At first, the issues were blamed on faulty equipment, but when Nevaeh reached the patrol zone, she quickly noticed the same unsettling stillness other rangers had mentioned. The trees towered overhead like massive pillars, their roots twisting through thick layers of moss and soil that had remained undisturbed for centuries. As she moved through the forest, her attention was drawn to a patch of ground that looked slightly sunken compared to the surrounding terrain. It wasn't obvious at first glance, but once she crouched down and brushed away the moss, the outline of a large circular structure appeared beneath the surface. The stone disc was almost perfectly smooth and fitted tightly into the earth, as if it had been intentionally designed to remain hidden. Neve felt a chill run through her despite the warm summer air. She had heard rumors from other rangers about strange underground discoveries in remote sections of forest, but until that moment she had never truly believed them. Yet the circular stone beneath her hands was undeniable. It was an entrance to something buried deep below the forest floor. Using a small pry bar from her pack, Neve carefully lifted one edge of the stone lid. It shifted with surprising ease, revealing a narrow shaft descending straight into darkness. A wave of stale, humid air rose from below, carrying the scent of wet earth and something faintly organic. Neve secured a rope to a nearby tree before lowering herself cautiously into the opening, her flashlight illuminating the stone walls as she descended. The shaft ended in a wide chamber, carved directly into bedrock. Unlike natural caves, the surfaces of the room were smooth and deliberate, shaped with careful precision that suggested intelligent construction rather than erosion. When Neve stepped off the rope and onto the floor, the beam of her flashlight revealed something deeply unsettling along the perimeter of the chamber. Small stone cradles were carved into the rock floor in evenly spaced intervals, each one shaped like a shallow basin designed to hold something roughly the size of a newborn animal or a human infant. There were 7 of them arranged in a semicircle, their interiors polished smooth from repeated use. Some contained faint dark stains embedded into the stone, while others were lined with a thin residue that reflected the flashlight beam with a dull sheen. The air inside the chamber felt unnaturally humid, almost thick, and Nevaeh realized there were no visible ventilation shafts anywhere in the room. Whatever had used this space must have been capable of surviving in conditions that would quickly suffocate a human. As Nevaeh moved slowly around the chamber, documenting the structures with her camera, she noticed something that made the situation even more disturbing. Between the cradles were long, shallow grooves etched into the stone floor. They formed irregular paths leading from each cradle toward a narrow tunnel carved into the far wall of the chamber. The grooves weren't random scratches. They were consistent patterns that looked like the dragging marks of multiple limbs moving across the rock. Kneeling down to examine one of the tracks more closely, Nevaeh saw that the grooves had 4 distinct pressure points repeating along their length, spaced in a pattern that didn't match the movement of any animal she knew. It looked almost as if something heavy had crawled along the floor using several limbs at once. The grooves all converged toward the same place, the narrow tunnel disappearing deeper into the bedrock. Nevaeh directed her flashlight into the passage, but the beam quickly vanished into darkness after a few meters. The tunnel sloped downward at a steep angle, suggesting it continued far below the chamber. As she studied the passage, a quiet realization formed in her mind. The chamber wasn't just a hidden room beneath the forest, it was part of a larger underground system. The cradles were positioned too deliberately to be anything random. They looked like incubation spaces designed to hold something until it was strong enough to move on its own. And judging by the grooves leading into the tunnel, whatever had once rested in those cradles eventually crawled deeper underground. While Nevaeh continued documenting the chamber, her flashlight briefly illuminated something inside one of the cradles that made her pause. At the base of the stone basin was a thin layer of translucent material clinging to the surface like dried film. It looked similar to biological residue left behind by certain amphibians or insects during early developmental stages, but far thicker and more fibrous. Maeve carefully collected a small sample using sterile tools from her ranger kit, sealing it into a specimen container. As she stood up again, the chamber suddenly felt quieter than before, so quiet that the faintest sound echoed sharply off the stone walls. At first, she thought it was just her breathing reverberating through the chamber. Then she heard it again. Distant scraping sound drifted up from the tunnel entrance, barely audible but unmistakably deliberate. Nevaeh turned off her flashlight for a moment and stood perfectly still, listening. The darkness inside the chamber was absolute, swallowing every detail. The scraping came again, slightly louder this time, followed by a soft shifting noise as if loose soil or rock had been disturbed. The sound lasted only a few seconds before fading back into silence. But the brief echo was enough to send a cold wave of realization through her. The underground system beneath that chamber was not empty. Nevaeh climbed out of the shaft faster than she had descended. Once back on the forest floor, she replaced the circular stone lid and covered it again with moss and soil, restoring the ground as closely as possible to the way she had found it. The sunlight filtering through the trees suddenly felt brighter than before, but the forest itself remained eerily silent. As she stood there, catching her breath, Nevaeh realized that what she had discovered was far more than an isolated underground room. Similar chambers had been reported in other remote sections of forest, always hidden beneath untouched terrain and always containing the same unsettling stone cradles. If these structures were truly nurseries, then something had been raising its young beneath the forest floor for a very long time, long enough for the entrances to disappear beneath centuries of moss and roots. And somewhere beneath that chamber, beyond the narrow tunnel descending into darkness, whatever used those cradles might still exist, waiting, growing, hidden in the vast underground spaces that humans had never thought to explore beneath the oldest forests on Earth.